Before we begin this journey of resilience and hope, please take a brief second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. Now, let's begin. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it presided over the city. It was a constant rhythmic drumming that dictated the pace of life in the Pacific Northwest. For Sarah, the sound was a comforting metronome. It matched the steady, meticulous ticking of her mind. Sarah was not your average mechanic. Her workshop, located in a repurposed industrial loft in the Fremont district, didn't smell like grease and gasoline. It smelled of ozone, 3D printing filaments, and strong coffee. The sign on the frosted glass door read, "Kinetic Solutions." A vague enough name to cover what she actually did. She fixed things that the world had given up on. At 34, Sarah was a single mother to a teenage son who was currently away at a science camp, leaving her alone with her inventions. She was a former biomedical engineer who had left the high-pressure corporate world of medical device manufacturing. The industry had been too focused on profit margins and patent wars, and not enough on the people who actually needed the limbs and braces she designed. So she went rogue. She took custom commissions, fixing vintage electronics, building adaptive controllers for gamers with arthritis, and occasionally taking on pro bono cases that tugged at her heartstrings. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the gray sky merged seamlessly with the gray concrete of the streets when the bell above her door chimed. Sarah looked up from her workbench. She was currently soldering a connection on a haptic feedback glove. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he took up too much space for the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a rigid tension that Sarah recognized instantly. It was the posture of someone who expected a threat from every corner. He wore a faded tactical jacket that had seen better days, dark jeans, and boots that were polished despite the mud outside. His face was a map of weathered lines, handsome but guarded, with eyes that scanned the room before settling on her. But it wasn't the man who caught Sarah's attention. It was the girl beside him. She sat in a wheelchair that looked heavy and cumbersome, a standard-issue hospital model that was clearly ill-suited for her size. She looked to be about 7 or 8 years old. Her hair was pulled back in careful, tight braids, the kind a father does when he is trying his absolute best but doesn't quite have the dexterity for it. Her legs were strapped in, motionless. "I was told you can fix anything," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of pleasantries. It wasn't rude, just efficient. Sarah set down her soldering iron and wiped her hands on a rag. "I can fix most things, depending on what it is." The man stepped further in, pushing the wheelchair. "My truck. The transmission is slipping. A guy at the hardware store said you do side work on engines if the cause is right." Sarah blinked. She did know engines, but that wasn't her specialty. However, looking at the wet shoulders of his jacket and the way the little girl was shivering slightly under a thin blanket, she didn't have the heart to send him to a commercial garage that would overcharge him. "I'm Sarah," she said, walking around the counter. "Mark," he replied. He pointed a thumb at the girl. "This is Mia." Mia offered a shy, small smile. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi, Mia." Sarah smiled back, crouching down slightly to be at eye level, a habit from her days in pediatric clinics. As she did, her eyes naturally analyzed Mia's positioning in the chair. The ergonomics were terrible. The footrests were too low, causing pressure on the girl's thighs. The back support was rigid, likely causing spinal fatigue. Sarah stood up. "I can take a look at the truck, Mark. Pull it into the bay around the back. But while I do that, would you mind if Mia stayed in here? It's warmer and I have some cocoa." Mark hesitated. His eyes narrowed slightly, a defensive reflex. "She stays where I can see her. There's a window into the bay." Sarah pointed. "She can watch you the whole time." Mark nodded, seemingly satisfied. He wheeled Mia to a spot near the heater, adjusted her blanket with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his stony demeanor, and went to move the truck. As Sarah gathered her tools, she couldn't stop looking at Mia. She saw the tremor in the girl's hands as she reached for a magazine on the low table. It wasn't just the legs. It was a neurological disconnect. Sarah's engineer brain began to whirl, not about the truck transmission, but about the angle of Mia's spine and the unused potential in her upper body muscles. She went out to the bay. Mark had the hood up on an old battered Ford F-150. The vehicle was a beast, but it was tired, just like its owner. "It's not the transmission fluid," Sarah said after 5 minutes of inspection. "It's the torque converter. It's shuddering." Mark ran a hand over his face, sighing. "Is it expensive?" "Parts are. Labor is worse," Sarah said honestly. "But I can source a refurbished part. It'll take a few days." Mark's shoulders slumped. Just a fraction of an inch, but to Sarah it looked like a mountain collapsing. "We need the truck. I have shifts across town. Public transport doesn't work with..." He gestured toward the window where Mia sat. "I can give you a loaner," Sarah offered. "I have an old station wagon. It fits the chair." Mark looked at her, searching for the catch. "Why?" "Because," Sarah said, wiping grease from her thumb, "I know what it's like to be the only one holding the world up. You look like you could use a break, Mark." He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, a sharp single motion. But in his eyes, Sarah saw the first crack in the armor. It was the look of a man who had been drowning so long he had forgotten what air tasted like. The next day, Mark returned to the shop, not for the truck, but because he had forgotten Mia's specialized seat cushion in the Ford. Sarah had spent the previous evening researching. She hadn't been able to help herself. Based on Mia's movement patterns and the muscle atrophy she noticed, she suspected a severe case of incomplete spinal cord injury, perhaps compounded by a degenerative condition. When Mark walked in, the shop was quiet. Sarah was working on a prosthetic arm for a veteran, a carbon fiber piece that looked more like art than a medical device. Mark froze when he saw it on the table. He stared at the mechanical hand, the exposed servos, the intricate wiring. "I thought you were a mechanic," Mark said, his voice tight. "I am," Sarah replied, not looking up from the calibration she was running. "I'm a mechanic for the human body. I used to design these for a living." Mark walked over, his eyes tracing the lines of the prosthetic. "Navy issue?" he asked, pointing to a serial number style he recognized. "Similar specs," Sarah said. "But better. The government contracts go to the lowest bidder. I build for the user, not the budget." Mark let out a short, cynical laugh. "You got that right." He paused, looking at his hands. "I was a SEAL, 12 years. It was the first piece of personal history he had offered. It explained everything. The hypervigilance, the physical condition, the silence. "Thank you for your service," Sarah said softly. "Don't." Mark cut her off, though not unkindly. "Just don't." He retrieved the cushion and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back at Sarah, then at the prosthetic, then out the window at the loaner car where Mia was waiting. "She wasn't born like that," Mark said abruptly. The words seemed to tear themselves out of his throat. "Car accident. 3 years ago. My wife. She didn't make it. Mia survived, but the spinal compression was severe. T10 incomplete." Sarah put down her tools. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with his grief. "I'm so sorry, Mark." "The VA covers me," he continued, ignoring her sympathy. "But they don't cover her. Private insurance capped out last year. She's growing. The chair doesn't fit. The braces cause sores. I'm working double shifts at a security firm just to pay for therapy that doesn't seem to be doing anything." He looked at Sarah, his eyes burning with a mixture of pride and desperation. "You build limbs." "I do." "Can you build legs?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't a request for magic. It was a father asking if there was any technology, any scrap of metal and wire that could give his daughter back a piece of her childhood. Sarah sighed, leaning back against her workbench. "It's not that simple, Mark. An exoskeleton, which is what she would need, is incredibly complex. It requires customized motors, gyroscopes, a neural interface, or at least a very sensitive kinetic trigger system. It costs tens of thousands of dollars in materials alone. Mark nodded, the hope dying in his eyes instantly. Right. Stupid question. Forget I asked. Wait, Sarah said as he turned the handle. She walked around the counter. She thought about the educational aspect of her life, how she taught her son that problems were just solutions waiting to be engineered. She thought about the half-finished prototypes in her back room. She thought about the waste in the medical industry, the discarded titanium and high-torque motors she had salvaged over the years. I didn't say I couldn't do it, Sarah said firmly. I said it's expensive and complex, but I have a graveyard of parts in the back. And I have time. Mark stared at her. I can't pay you, not what you're worth. I don't want your money, Mark. I want to test a theory. Sarah lied. She didn't have a theory. She just had a need to help. I've been wanting to prototype a pediatric assistance unit. Mia would be a beta tester, if you agree. Mark looked at her, searching for the catch again. He was a man trained to look for traps, for ambushes. But here, in this workshop that smelled of rain and solder, he found only a woman with grease on her cheek and a challenge in her eyes. What do you need? Mark asked. Bring her in tomorrow, Sarah said. We need to measure everything. And Mark, bring her old medical scans. I need to see the bone density. The process began with an argument, not a loud one, but a friction of methodologies. Mark was military. He understood drills, repetition, and force of will. Sarah was scientific. She understood leverage, fulcrums, and material stress points. Mia was placed on a specialized scanning table Sarah had constructed. It used a hacked Kinect sensor and structured light to create a 3D topographic map of Mia's body. Stand straight, Mia, Mark commanded gently. Chin up. She can't stand straight, Mark, Sarah corrected gently, studying the monitor. Her center of gravity is shifted forward to compensate for the lack of pelvic control. If we force her straight, we strain the lumbar vertebrae. If she doesn't build the core strength, the machine does the work for her, Mark argued. Then she gets weaker. This isn't a crutch. Sarah turned to him. It's a bridge. We aren't building a machine to carry her. We are building a machine that listens to her muscles and amplifies the signals she's already sending. It's called active assistance, not passive transport. This was the educational core of what Sarah did. She explained to Mark and to Mia, who was listening intently, how the device would work. Muscles produce tiny electrical signals called electromyography signals, or EMG, Sarah explained, placing a small sensor on Mia's thigh. Even though Mia can't move her legs to walk, the nerves are still firing, trying to send the command. The signal is just too weak to create the motion, or the connection is disrupted. She pointed to the screen where a faint, jagged line appeared. See that spike? That's Mia trying to kick. Mia's eyes went wide. I did that. You did, Sarah smiled. My machine will have sensors that detect that tiny spike. When it sees the spike, the computer says, Mia wants to step, and it activates the servo motor at the knee and hip to finish the movement you started. Mark stared at the screen, mesmerized by the jagged line. It was visual proof of his daughter's effort, visible evidence of the fight she waged inside her own body every day. So she controls it, Mark said softly. 100%, Sarah affirmed. It won't move unless she tries. It trains her neural pathways, neuroplasticity. The brain learns that trying equals movement. Over time, it can actually improve her natural control. The concept was sound. The execution was the nightmare. For the next 2 weeks, the Kinetic Solutions workshop became their second home. Mark would pick Mia up from school and bring her straight to the shop. While Sarah worked on the CAD designs and 3D printed the custom joints, Mark made himself useful. He organized her tools with military precision. He swept the floors. He even fixed the leaky roof in the back storage room. It was his way of paying. But the real challenge was the materials. Sarah needed aircraft-grade aluminum for the frame. Lightweight but rigid. She needed high torque, low-profile brushless motors that wouldn't make Mia look like a robot from a bad 80s movie. "The motors are the problem," Sarah admitted one late evening. Rain was lashing against the windows. Mia was asleep on a cot in the corner, covered in Mark's tactical jacket. "Standard servos are too jerky. They're robotic. We need harmonic drives for smooth motion, but a set of 4. That's $5,000. Mark looked at his sleeping daughter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He extracted a card. "I have a savings account for her college. There's about $3,000 in it. Keep it," Sarah said immediately. "We need that for the future." "She needs a present, Sarah," Mark snapped, his voice dropping to a whisper so as not to wake Mia. "What good is college if she spends the next 10 years trapping inside that chair, watching life pass her by? Take it." "I can't," Sarah said, "because I found another way, but it's risky." Mark looked at her. "I was a SEAL. I lived on risky." "I have a contact at a recycling center for industrial robotics," Sarah said. "They scrap assembly line arms. The motors in those are powerful, but they're heavy and run on high voltage. If I can strip them down, rewind the coils for lower voltage, and machine new housings, we can make them work." "Rewind the coils?" Mark asked, frowning. "That sounds like weeks of work." "It is," Sarah smiled tiredly. "But it's free. I just need hands, strong hands with steady fingers." Mark looked at his own hands. Hands that had held rifles, defused explosives, and carried his wounded friends. He looked at Sarah. "Show me what to do," he said. And so the partnership truly began. It wasn't just Sarah building a miracle anymore. It was a father dismantling the machinery of the industrial world, strand by copper strand, to weave a new set of legs for his daughter. The scene was set. A dimly lit workshop, the relentless Seattle rain, a sleeping child, and 2 broken adults working under the glow of a halogen lamp, binding their hopes into metal and wire. But as Sarah would soon discover, the mechanics were the easy part. The real breaking point was yet to come. The workshop became a capsule out of time. Outside, the Seattle autumn turned from a gentle gray drizzle to a relentless pounding storm that lashed against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse. Inside, the world was reduced to the microscopic interaction between copper wire and magnetic fields. For 3 weeks, Sarah and Mark existed in a bubble of shared purpose. The task Sarah had set for them was grueling, rewinding the stators of industrial motors to change their electromagnetic properties. It was tedious, eye-straining work that required a surgeon's steady hand and a saint's patience. "You have to keep the tension consistent," Sarah instructed, her voice low as she peered through a magnifying loop. "If the copper wire is too loose, the vibration will wear through the insulation and short the motor. If it's too tight, you snap the wire." Mark sat opposite her at the workbench, a giant hunched over a component the size of a soda can. His large, calloused fingers that had mastered the disassemble of an M4 carbine in pitch darkness, were struggling with the hair-thin magnet wire. "This is harder than bomb disposal," Mark grunted, a bead of sweat tracking down his temple despite the chill in the room. "At least with a bomb, you know immediately if you messed up." "This is engineering," Sarah replied without looking up. "You don't know you messed up until you're fully assembled and the system fails." "It teaches you humility." "I have enough humility," Mark muttered, carefully looping the copper strand around the armature. "Life gave me plenty." Sarah paused. She watched him work. Over the last few weeks, the walls Mark had erected began to lower, brick by brick. They bonded not over coffee or small talk, but over the work. There is a specific intimacy in shared labor, a silent language spoken in the passing of tools and the holding of flashlights. "Why are we doing this again?" Mark asked after a long silence. "Why not just use them as is?" Sarah set down her tools, seizing the moment for an educational break. She grabbed a marker and turned to the whiteboard she kept near the bench. Torque constant, or kTau, Sarah wrote the symbol on the board. And velocity constant, or kV. She drew a simple graph. Think of the motor like a lung. The industrial robots these motors came from were designed to move very fast with light loads, painting cars or soldering chips. They have a high kVDAU, high speed per volt. But Mia doesn't need speed. She needs torque. She needs the strength to lift her own body weight against gravity. Mark nodded, his eyes locked on the diagram. He was a tactical thinker. He understood mission requirements. By rewinding the coils with thinner wire and more turns, Sarah explained, drawing more loops on her diagram, we increase the magnetic field strength for the same amount of current. We are trading speed for power. We are changing the motor's DNA. It's exactly like training for a ruck march. You don't train to sprint. You train to carry weight over distance. We are building endurance into the metal. Mark looked down at the copper coil in his hand with newfound respect. We're giving it grit. Exactly, Sarah smiled. We're engineering grit. It wasn't just the motors. They had to solve the power problem. Batteries were heavy. Lithium polymer cells were energy-dense but volatile. If we put enough batteries on the frame to last all day, the suit becomes too heavy for her to balance, Sarah explained one evening while they ate takeout Thai food on the workshop floor. Mia was nearby, doing her homework on a tablet, wearing noise-canceling headphones. What about a backpack? Mark suggested. I carried 80 pounds in the teams. We distribute the load. Mia isn't a SEAL, Mark. Her spine can't take axial loading, Sarah countered gently. We have to mount the batteries low, on the thighs, to lower the center of gravity. But that increases the swing weight of the legs. It's a pendulum problem. T sada tuad pi raskar. If the mass is too far down, the leg becomes a heavy pendulum that takes too much energy to swing forward. Mark stopped eating. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her. Her hair was messy, tied up with a pencil. There were dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't billed him a dime. She was losing sleep to calculate the swing dynamics of his daughter's legs. Why are you doing this? Mark asked quietly. And don't give me the I like a challenge line. Sarah looked away, tracing the rim of her paper cup. My son Leo. He's at science camp now. But when he was born, he had clubfoot. Bilateral. Doctor said he'd never run. I spent the first 4 years of his life designing braces, stretching tendons, fighting insurance companies. She looked up at Mark. I fixed him. He runs cross-country now. But I remember the feeling of helplessness. I remember looking at a world designed for everyone else and realizing my child was locked out of it. No parent should have to feel that. And no child should have to wait for a miracle when the physics already exist to solve the problem. Mark reached out and for the first time initiated contact. He placed his large hand over hers on the table. It was brief, heavy and warm. Thank you, he said. The voice was rough like gravel grinding together. Let's get back to work, Sarah whispered, her throat tight. We have 2 more stators to wind. The prototype was ready for a bench test on a Friday night. The device looked skeletal and intimidating hanging from the test rig in the center of the bay. It was a lower-body exoskeleton made of brushed aluminum and carbon fiber. The re-wound motors sat at the hip and knee joints, housed in custom-machined casings that Sarah and Mark had polished until they shone. Wires snaked through the frame like veins, connecting to a central control unit, a microcontroller roughly the size of a deck of cards, strapped to the waist belt. Mia was not in the suit. Safety protocol dictated a phantom load test first. Sarah had attached weighted sandbags to the legs to simulate Mia's body mass. Systems check, Sarah announced, her voice trembling slightly. She sat at her computer terminal, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Battery voltage stable at 24 volts. Sensors calibrated. Mark stood by the rig, a fire extinguisher in hand. It was a grim joke between them, but also a necessary precaution with experimental electronics. Ready on the kill switch, Mark said, his jaw set. Initiating walking gait algorithm. Test sequence Alpha 1. Sarah typed the command and hit enter. A high-pitched whine filled the room, the sound of the pulse width modulation, PWM signals engaging the motors. Whir, click. The right leg of the exoskeleton jerked forward. It was a violent, spasmodic motion. The sandbag swung wildly. Stabilizing, Sarah muttered, typing furiously. Gains are too high. Adjusting PID loop. Whir, clank. The left leg attempted to follow but moved too fast. It collided with the right leg. The metal frame shuddered. The motors began to scream, a high, discordant pitch indicating a stall current. "It's fighting itself," Mark yelled. "Sarah, shut it down." "I can fix it. It's just a timing error in the code," Sarah argued, her eyes glued to the scrolling data on her screen. "The gyroscope is reading the drift wrong." Suddenly, a spark popped from the right hip joint, followed by a puff of acrid blue smoke. The smell of burning insulation, the nightmare scent for any engineer, filled the air. "Kill it!" Sarah screamed. Mark slammed the big red emergency stop button. The machine went dead instantly, the legs hanging limp and lifeless, swinging slightly from the momentum. Silence rushed back into the room, louder than the noise had been. The only sound was the hiss of the rain outside and the rapid breathing of the two adults. Sarah slumped in her chair, burying her face in her hands. The winding insulation melted. The amperage spiked too high. I pushed it too hard. Mark set the fire extinguisher down. He walked over to the machine and touched the motor casing. "It's hot," he said. "Damn hot." He looked at the smoking ruin of 3 weeks of work. Then he looked at Sarah, who looked defeated. "Maybe," Mark started, his voice hollow, "maybe this is a sign. Maybe we're trying to play God." "It's not God, Mark. It's physics," Sarah snapped, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "I missed a variable. I didn't account for the thermal buildup in the enclosed casing. I just need to vent it. I need to add active cooling. And what if that happens when Mia is in it?" Mark's voice rose, the protective father emerging. "What if that shorts out and locks the joint? She falls. She breaks a bone she can't feel. Or worse, the battery cooks off." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "I can't risk her, Sarah. She's all I have. I can't let her be a guinea pig for an experiment that burns." "She's not a guinea pig," Sarah said softly, standing up. "She's a pilot, and pilots need safe planes. I won't put her in it until it's perfect. But you can't quit now." The motor worked, Mark. Did you see the torque? It lifted the 40-pound sandbag like it was a feather before the thermal shutdown. The strength is there. We just need to control the heat. Mark looked at the machine, then at the empty wheelchair parked in the corner. He thought about the school dances Mia would miss, the hiking trails he used to walk with his wife, the life Mia deserved. "You have until Monday," Mark said, his voice low. "If it's not safe by Monday, we scrap it, and I go back to saving for the standard chair." He grabbed his jacket and walked out into the rain, leaving Sarah alone with the smell of ozone and failure. Saturday was a blur of caffeine and code. Sarah didn't go home. She slept for 2 hours on the floor of the shop. She redesigned the motor housings, using the shop's CNC mill to carve cooling fins into the aluminum casing to dissipate heat. She added miniature 5-volt fans, salvaged from old laptops, to force air over the copper coils. But the hardware was only half the battle. The software was the soul of the machine. The issue was the PID controller, proportional integral derivative. It's the mathematical logic that allows a robot to move smoothly rather than jerking between positions. Proportional, P, corrects the error right now. If I'm leaning forward, push back. Integral, I, corrects the accumulated error over time. If I've been leaning forward for a while, push back harder. Derivative, D, predicts future error. I'm leaning forward fast, so I better slow down before I fall. Sarah realized her derivative value was too aggressive. The machine was reacting to phantom movements, creating a feedback loop that shook the frame apart. She had to soften the math. She had to teach the computer to be gentle. On Sunday morning, the door opened. Sarah braced herself for Mark's stern face. Instead, Mia rolled in, pushing her own chair, with Mark trailing behind, carrying a box of donuts and a thermos of coffee. "Dad said you were in mad scientist mode," Mia chirped. "So we brought fuel." Sarah looked up, her face smudged with grease, her eyes red. She smiled, and it was genuine. "You have no idea how much I need that donut." Mark set the coffee down. He didn't ask how it was going. He just looked at the new cooling fans installed on the rig. He noticed the changes. He saw the work. "I'm sorry about Friday," Mark said gruffly. "I got scared." "Fear is good," Sarah said, taking a bite of a glazed donut. "Fear keeps us checking our safety margins. Come here, Mia. I need to show you something." Sarah wheeled Mia over to the computer screens. "This is your brain," Sarah said, pointing to the lines of code. "Well, the leg's brain. It was thinking too fast. It was getting anxious. So I taught it how to meditate." "Meditate?" Mia giggled. "Yup. I slowed down its reaction time by 0.05 seconds. It sounds small, but for a computer, that's a deep breath. It stops the jitters." Sarah looked at Mark. "We're going to test it again. No sandbags. Just the frame moving on its own." Mark nodded. "Do it." Sarah hit the key. The sound was different this time. It wasn't a high-pitched scream. It was a low, powerful drone, like a hive of bees. The right leg lifted, knee bending gracefully. It extended, heel striking the imaginary ground. The left leg followed, left, right, left, right. It was walking, smoothly, rhythmically. Mia watched, her mouth slightly open. "It looks like walking." "It is walking, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Mark walked around the machine, inspecting the motors. He held his hand near the casings. "Cool to the touch," he reported. "Fans are working." He looked at Sarah across the machine. The tension of Friday night had evaporated, replaced by a terrifying electric hope. "It works on the stand," Mark said, "but the stand doesn't fight back. It doesn't have balance issues. It doesn't have fear." "No," Sarah agreed. "That's the next step. We need to strap it to a human, but not Mia, not yet." "Then who?" Mia asked. Sarah looked at Mark. He was 6'2". The frame was sized for a child. "Me," Sarah said. "I built an adjustable test rig. I can strap the lower leg assembly to my arms. If it can lift my body weight doing a push-up motion, it can hold Mia." It was an unorthodox test. Sarah strapped the robotic legs to her forearms, her hands gripping the feet. She positioned herself in a plank position on the floor. "Okay," Sarah said, gritting her teeth. "Mark, hit the command for stand." Mark hesitated, his finger over the enter key. "If this twists, it snaps your wrists, Sarah." "Trust the math," Sarah said, staring at the floor. "Hit it." Mark pressed the key. The motors engaged. Sarah felt the surge of power, not jerky, but hydraulic and immense. The machine pushed against the floor. Without Sarah using her own muscles, the exoskeleton lifted her upper body off the ground, holding her in a perfect plank. She laughed, a breathless, hysterical sound. "It's got me," she yelled. "I'm not doing anything. It's holding 140 pounds of resistance effortlessly." Mia clapped her hands. "Iron Man, you're Iron Man." Mark watched Sarah suspended there by the machine she had built from scrap. He saw the joy on her face, the pure, unadulterated triumph of intellect over matter. And for the first time in 3 years, since the headlights of the oncoming car had blinded him, Mark felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to lift. He knelt down beside Sarah as she deactivated the suit and collapsed gently to the mat. "You're crazy," he said, but he was smiling, a real smile. "We're ready," Sarah panted, rubbing her wrists. "Tomorrow, we fit Mia. But as is the nature of engineering and life, solving one problem often reveals another. The mechanics were sound. The code was stable. But Sarah had forgotten the most variable component of all, the human interface. Connecting the machine to Mia wasn't just about straps and buckles, it was about trust, and Mia, terrified of falling again, was about to face a psychological wall no motor could push through. Monday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The rain had ceased, but the air remained thick and humid, clinging to everything it touched. Inside Kinetic Solutions, the atmosphere was brittle with tension. The exoskeleton, now fully assembled and painted a matte charcoal grey, hung suspended from a gantry crane in the center of the room. Sarah had added padding, memory foam lined with soft, breathable fabric, to the contact points at the hips, thighs, and shins. It looked less like a skeleton now, and more like armor. "Okay, Mia," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a Velcro strap. "We're going to take this slow. The machine is in passive mode. It won't move unless you initiate the command sequence we practiced." Mia sat in her wheelchair, staring at the empty metal legs. She was wearing leggings and a fitted thermal shirt. She looked small. Too small for the machinery, too small for the weight of the moment. "What if I fall?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark knelt beside her. He took her hand, engulfing it in his own. "I've got the safety tether," he said, pointing to a climbing rope attached to the overhead beam and clipped to the back of the exoskeleton's harness. "And I'm right here. I'm your spotter. You know I don't drop things." Mia managed a weak smile. "Except the eggs that one time." Mark chuckled, a dry, nervous sound. "Except the eggs. But I won't drop you." The transfer was a delicate operation. Mark lifted Mia from her chair, his movements practiced and gentle, and lowered her into the open frame of the exoskeleton. Sarah moved quickly, securing the buckles. Click, click, click. The sound echoed in the quiet shop like the loading of a weapon. "Straps tight?" Sarah asked. "Tight," Mia said, her breathing shallow. "Systems on," Sarah announced. She pressed the power button on the waist unit. A soft blue LED pulse began to beat at Mia's hip. The cooling fans whirred to life, a low, comforting hum. "Okay," Sarah said. "We're going to try a stand command. Just a stand. Remember the trigger. Lean forward slightly, engage your core, and push down with your hands on the crutches." Mia gripped the forearm crutches Sarah had modified with control buttons. She closed her eyes. She took a breath. She triggered the sequence. The motors whined. The suit engaged. Slowly, powerfully, the metal legs began to straighten. Mia rose. Up, up. Out of the seated position she had occupied for 3 years. She rose until she was standing at her full height, eye level with the top of Sarah's workbench. For a second, it was magical. Mia's eyes flew open, wide with wonder. She was tall. She was upright. I'm standing," she gasped. But then, the physics of biology clashed with the physics of the machine. Because Mia had no sensation below the waist, her brain received no feedback from her feet. She couldn't feel the floor. To her vestibular system, the inner ear balance mechanism, she was floating in a void. She was disconnected from the earth. Panic, primal and immediate, seized her. "I'm falling," Mia screamed, flailing her arms. The motion confused the gyroscopes. The suit tried to compensate, jerking slightly to the left. "You're not falling, I've got you," Mark yelled, grabbing the harness handles. "Get me down. I can't feel the floor. My legs are gone." Mia was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. "Take it off, Daddy, take it off." The terror in her voice was absolute. It wasn't just fear of falling. It was the psychological horror of a phantom limb disconnect. Her eyes saw her feet on the ground, but her brain screamed that she was hovering over an abyss. "Abort!" Mark barked at Sarah. "Shut it down!" Sarah scrambled for the keyboard. "Powering down! Sitting sequence engaged!" The motors reversed. The suit lowered Mia back into the safety of gravity, back to the familiar seated height. As soon as she was unbuckled, Mia curled into a ball in her wheelchair, sobbing into her father's chest. Mark wrapped his arms around her, glaring at the machine over her head with a look of pure betrayal. "We're done," Mark whispered, rocking his daughter. "We're done." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by Mia's soft hiccups. Sarah stood by the computer, feeling like a criminal. She had focused so much on the torque, dollars, and the current, she had forgotten the most important variable, the pilot. Mark wheeled Mia to the corner, gave her some water, and waited until she calmed down. Then he walked over to Sarah. He didn't yell. He looked exhausted, defeated. "She can't do it, Sarah," he said quietly. "It's too much. She can't trust the legs if she can't feel them." "It's proprioception," Sarah murmured, staring at the floor. "What?" "Proprioception," Sarah repeated, turning to the whiteboard. She needed to explain this, to understand it herself. "It's the body's sixth sense. It's how you know where your hand is, even if your eyes are closed. It's how you know how hard to step on the ground." Mia has lost that loop. Her eyes say, "I am standing," but her nerves say, "Nothing exists below my waist." The cognitive dissonance causes extreme vertigo and panic. "So that's it," Mark said, leaning against the bench. "Science wins. Biology loses. We can't fix a severed spinal cord, Sarah, no matter how good your motors are." Sarah looked at the suit. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was a dead thing. A shell. "We can't fix the cord," Sarah said, her mind racing. She thought about her son, Leo. When he was learning to walk with his braces, he couldn't feel his toes properly. So she had him walk on different textures, sand, gravel, carpet, to stimulate the nerves he did have. "We don't need to fix the cord," Sarah said, her eyes widening. "We need to bypass it." Mark frowned. "You said no magic." "Not magic. Sensory substitution." Sarah grabbed a tablet and pulled up a diagram of the human nervous system. "Mark, look. Her spinal cord is damaged at T10. That means everything below the belly button is offline. But everything above is working perfectly. Her chest, her back, her shoulders. They are full of sensitive nerve endings. So we map the feet to the shoulders," Sarah said, the excitement creeping back into her voice. "We put pressure sensors in the soles of the robot boots. When the robot heel hits the ground, it sends a signal, not to the motors but to a vibration pad on her shoulder. Left heel, left shoulder buzz, right toe, right ribs buzz." She looked at Mark, pleading with him to understand. "We create a phantom map. Her brain is plastic. It's young. If we train her, within days, her brain will learn that buzz on left shoulder means left foot is on the ground. She will feel the floor through her shoulders." Mark looked at her skeptically. "You want to wire my daughter like a bomb disposal robot?" "I want to give her a sense of touch," Sarah said. "It's used for blind people. Cameras that turn images into vibrations on the tongue or back. It works, Mark. I swear it works." Mark looked back at Mia, who was watching them with red, puffy eyes. She looked terrified, but she also looked curious. "One more try," Mark said, holding up a finger. "But we test the sensation first. No suit, just the sensors. If it freaks her out, we stop." The next 3 days were a frenzy of soldering and hacking. Sarah cannibalized everything she could find. She took the vibration motors out of 4 old Xbox controllers. She dismantled a broken cell phone for its haptic engine. She sewed a compression vest for Mia, a snug athletic top. Inside the lining, she embedded the vibration motors, 2 on the shoulders, 2 on the ribs, 2 on the lower back. She connected these to the pressure sensors she installed in the insoles of the exoskeleton's boots. Wednesday evening. The rain was back, a torrential downpour that made the workshop feel like a submarine. "Okay, Mia," Sarah said. Mia was wearing the vest, sitting in her wheelchair. The exoskeleton was on the other side of the room, standing empty. "We're going to play a game," Sarah explained. "I'm going to press on the robot's shoe." You tell me what you feel. Sarah walked over to the empty suit. She pressed her thumb hard against the left heel of the metal boot. Psst. Mia jumped slightly. Her hand went to her left shoulder. It tickled my shoulder, she said. Good, Sarah smiled. Now this. She pressed the right toe. Bzzzt. Right side, lower down, Mia reported. Exactly, Sarah said. Now close your eyes. Mia closed her eyes. Sarah began to tap a rhythm on the robot's feet. Left heel, left toe, right toe. A walking cadence. Mia's face scrunched up in concentration. Left, right, left, right. What does it feel like? Mark asked, watching intently. Mia paused. It feels like someone is tapping me. But if I imagine hard enough, it feels like walking. The room seemed to brighten. The ghost in the machine had been found. We need to calibrate it, Sarah said. We need to make the vibration strength match the pressure. A hard step should be a strong buzz, a soft step, a whisper. For the next 2 days, they didn't put Mia in the suit. They just trained. Sarah built a simulation on the computer where Mia had to navigate a character through a maze using only the feedback from the vest. It was gamification of physical therapy. Mia was competitive. She wanted to beat the high score. And in doing so, her brain was rewiring itself at a ferocious speed. The neural pathways were remapping. The sensory cortex was expanding its territory, accepting the shoulders as the new feet. By Friday, Mia could tell if Sarah was walking the robot on a hard floor or a carpet just by the vibration frequency. She's ready, Sarah said. Mark looked at his daughter. She wasn't the scared little girl from Monday. She was a pilot who knew her instrument. Saturday, Mark said. We do the full test on Saturday. And Sarah? Yeah? Invite your son, and I'll invite a few of the guys from the unit. If this really works. She needs an audience to cheer her on. She thrives on it. Sarah hesitated. An audience meant pressure. But looking at Mia's determined face, she realized Mark was right. This wasn't just a medical procedure anymore. It was a performance. It was a reclaiming of self. Okay, Sarah agreed. Saturday morning dawned crisp and cold. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of piercing crystalline blue. The workshop was transformed. Mark had cleared the bay. He had set up a runway, a long strip of clean, flat concrete. Sarah's son, Leo, had returned from camp. He was a lanky 15-year-old with his mother's eyes. He thought the exoskeleton was the coolest thing in the history of matter. He stood by the computer, ready to monitor telemetry. 3 of Mark's friends arrived. They were big men, silent and observant, wearing baseball caps and carrying the same watchful energy as Mark. They nodded at Sarah respectfully, but their eyes were on the girl. Mia was strapped in. The vest was connected. The suit was powered up. System check, Sarah called out. Battery 98%, Leo replied. Motor temps nominal, haptics active. Mark stood in front of Mia. He didn't hold the tether this time. He just held his hands out, ready to catch, but not interfering. Okay, Mia, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. Eyes up, feel the ground. Mia took a deep breath. She didn't look down at her legs. She looked straight at her father. Initiating, she whispered. She triggered the sensor in her crutch. Whir. The suit stood up. Mia rose, unfolding like a flower made of iron. She stood there, hovering. Status? Sarah asked, holding her breath. I feel it, Mia said, a smile breaking across her face. I feel the floor. It's solid. The vibration motors on her shoulders were telling her brain exactly where her center of gravity was. She wasn't floating. She was grounded. Walk to me, baby, Mark said, taking a step back. Come on. Mia leaned forward. The gyroscopes detected the shift. The left leg lifted. Bzzzt. Left shoulder disengaged. Clack. Left heel strike. Bzzzt. Strong impact signal to left shoulder. Left, Mia whispered. She shifted her weight. The right leg lifted. Clack. Right. She took a step. Then another. The servo motors sang their high-pitched song. The pneumatic pistons hissed. It was a mechanical symphony. Mia was walking, not dragging herself, not shuffling. She was walking with a steady, rhythmic gait, her eyes locked on her father, her smile growing wider with every step. The room was dead silent, save for the mechanical whirring. Mark's friends were standing at attention, watching with a reverence usually reserved for the flag. Leo was grinning so hard it looked like it hurt. Sarah watched from the console, tears blurring her vision of the data stream. The numbers were perfect, the heat was manageable, the miracle was holding. Mia reached the end of the runway, 10 feet from where she started. She stopped. The suit locked into a stable standing position. She looked at her dad. Mark was crying. Silent, streaming tears that tracked through the lines of his weathered face. He fell to his knees, not in despair, but to be at her level. "You did it," he choked out. "We did it," Mia corrected him. But just as the celebration was about to erupt, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the warehouse. The main drive shaft of the left knee, the recycled part from the industrial arm, had sheared under the torque. The left leg buckled instantly. "Mia!" Mark screamed, diving forward, but he was too far away. The suit collapsed, twisting violently as the metal snapped, sending Mia plummeting toward the concrete floor. The sound of metal shearing is unmistakable. It is a violent, final noise, like a gunshot in a library. When the left knee joint snapped, gravity took over instantly. Mia fell. "Maya!" Mark's scream tore through the air, raw and terrified, but Sarah had designed for failure. She hadn't slept for 3 weeks, obsessing over worst-case scenarios. She knew that recycled parts had microscopic fatigue cracks. She knew that hope wasn't a structural component. As the leg buckled, the suit didn't just crumble. The external roll cage, the carbon fiber ribs Sarah had aesthetically designed to look like armor, did exactly what they were engineered to do. They took the impact. Mia hit the ground hard, but she didn't hit the concrete. The exoskeleton absorbed the kinetic energy, the frame crunching and deforming around her like the crumple zone of a Volvo. The sensors triggered an instant lockout protocol, freezing the remaining joints so they wouldn't twist her limbs. Mark hit the floor a split second later, sliding on his knees to reach her. His hands were everywhere, checking her neck, her head, her spine. "Mia, Mia, talk to me." There was a moment of terrifying silence. The dust from the concrete floor hung in the air. Then a small, shaky voice came from inside the metal cage. I'm okay." Mark ripped the faceplate of the helmet open, a bike helmet they had customized. Mia's eyes were wide, filled with shock, but clear. "Are you hurt? Does anything hurt?" Mark demanded, his hands trembling. "No," Mia said, taking a gulp of air. "The suit, it hugged me." Sarah was there now, her face pale as a sheet, scanning the telemetry on her tablet even as she knelt. "The accelerometer registered 4 Gs of impact," she stammered. "The roll bar took 90% of the force. The safety cage held." Mark looked at Sarah. His eyes were wild. For a second, Sarah thought he was going to hit her. He had every right to be furious. She had put his daughter in a machine that broke. But Mark looked at the sheared metal of the knee joint. He saw the jagged edge of the recycled steel. He saw the carbon fiber cage that had sacrificed itself to save his daughter. He looked back at Mia. "We're getting you out, now." He began to undo the buckles with frantic speed. He pulled Mia out of the wreckage and held her to his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I got you. I got you." The room was silent. Leo, Sarah's son, was standing by the computer looking devastated. Mark's SEAL friends were standing in a protective semicircle. "That's it," Mark whispered into Mia's hair. "No more. We tried. It's too dangerous." He stood up, lifting Mia effortlessly in his arms. He looked at the broken heap of metal on the floor, the weeks of work, the melted credit cards, the late nights. "Thank you, Sarah," Mark said, his voice flat and dead. "Thank you for trying, but I can't lose her." He turned to walk away. "Wait." It wasn't Sarah who spoke. It was Mia. She squirmed in her father's arms. "Put me down, Dad." "Mia, we're going home," Mark said gently. "Put me down." Mark hesitated, then lowered her into her wheelchair which Leo had pushed forward. Mia adjusted her shirt. She wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek. She looked at the broken robot. Then she looked at her father. "It didn't fail because it was a bad idea," Mia said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "It failed because the metal was old. Sarah told us. We used junk." She looked at Sarah. "You said the math was right. Is the math right?" Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. "The math is perfect, Mia. It was the material yield strength. The recycled aluminum had a microfracture I couldn't see." Mia turned back to her father. "Then we don't stop." "Mia, no." She cut him off. "Dad, for 3 years, you told me that we don't quit when things get heavy. You told me that pain is just weakness leaving the body. Well, fear is just weakness leaving the mind. I walked. You saw me. I walked." She pointed a small finger at the wreckage. "Fix it." "Better." Mark looked at his daughter. He saw the fire in her eyes. The same fire he had seen in the mirrors of training camps 20 years ago. She wasn't broken. She was forged. He looked at his friends, the 3 men standing by the door. One of them, a giant man named Miller who ran a logistics company now, stepped forward. He took off his baseball cap and scratched his head. "Kid's right, Mark," Miller said. "It broke 'cause it was crap metal. You can't build a tank out of tin cans." Miller looked at Sarah. "What do you need to make it unbreakable? Not scrap, the real stuff." "Titanium grade 5 for the load-bearing joints," Sarah said, her voice gaining traction. 70075 T6 aluminum for the frame. High-torque Maxon motors, new ones, not rewound. "How much?" Miller asked. Sarah did the mental math. "Materials alone? 15,000, maybe 20. Miller nodded. He looked at the other 2 men. They nodded back. A silent communication of brotherhood. "We got the pot from the charity poker run next month," Miller said. "It was going to go to the general fund. I think the guys would vote to divert it to a specific mission." He walked over to Mark and put a hand on his shoulder. "We got the 6, brother. You provide the pilot. We provide the armor." Mark looked at his friends. He looked at Sarah, who was already holding a piece of the broken strut, analyzing the grain structure of the brake. He looked at Mia. The tears that welled in his eyes this time weren't from fear. They were from gratitude. "Titanium," Mark said, his voice rough. "We use titanium. If you've made it this far, you are part of this build. Don't forget to like the video to support the channel." 3 months later. The gymnasium of Lincoln Middle School was decorated with streamers and balloons. It was the winter formal. The theme was Starry Night. The air smelled of cheap fruit punch and teenage anxiety. Boys in ill-fitting suits stood in clusters. Girls in sparkly dresses giggled in corners. The DJ was playing a slow, rhythmic ballad. In the entryway, Sarah stood adjusting the tie of her son, Leo. She was wearing a nice dress, something she hadn't done in years. She looked nervous. "Do you have the toolkit?" she whispered. Leo patted his backpack. "Allen keys, backup battery, spare servos. I'm ready, Mom. Relax." "I can't relax," Sarah hissed. "This isn't a controlled environment. There are people spills, uneven floors." "She's ready," a deep voice said behind her. Sarah turned. Mark was there. He wasn't wearing his tactical jacket. He was wearing a dark suit, tailored to fit his broad frame. He looked clean-shaven, sharp, and incredibly handsome. But his eyes were glued to the door. "Where is she?" Sarah asked. "Getting ready," Mark said. "She wanted to make an entrance." The double doors opened. The room went quiet. Mia didn't roll in. She walked. The exoskeleton was no longer a prototype of exposed wires and grey metal. It was a sleek, polished work of art. The titanium frame was painted a deep, pearlescent blue to match her dress. The motors were silent, hidden beneath 3D printed fairings that mimicked the natural curve of a leg. She used the crutches for stability, but her movement was fluid. The months of training with the haptic vest had paid off. She could feel every step through her shoulders. She navigated the transition from the hallway tile to the gym floor with confident precision. A murmur went through the crowd of teenagers. Some stared, some whispered, but Mia didn't look at them. She looked at the dance floor. Mark walked up to her. He didn't hover. He didn't look like a bodyguard. He looked like a father. "May I have this dance, Miss Mia?" he asked, bowing slightly. Mia beamed. "You may." She tapped a command into her wrist controller. Mode. Sway. Sarah had programmed a special algorithm for this. It wasn't a walk. It was a gentle side-to-side weight shift, locking the knees but allowing the hips to pivot with the gyroscopes. Mark stepped in. He placed his hands on her waist, avoiding the battery packs. Mia placed her hands on his shoulders, not for balance, but for the embrace. They moved to the center of the floor. The suit hummed quietly, a hidden instrument in the song. Left, right, left, right. They turned in a slow circle. Mark looked down at his daughter. She wasn't looking at her feet. She was looking up at him, her eyes shining with the reflection of the disco ball. She was standing tall, eye to chest with him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't looking down at the top of her head in a wheelchair. He was holding her. The memory of the accident, the screech of tires, the hospital lights, the doctor's grim prognosis, began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic whir of the motors Sarah had built. Mark's composure, the iron discipline of a Navy SEAL, finally shattered. His face crumpled. He pulled Mia close, burying his face in her neck so the other kids wouldn't see. His shoulders shook. He wept, heaved with deep, silent sobs that released years of guilt, years of carrying her upstairs, years of fighting insurance companies, years of being strong when he felt weak. "I love you, Daddy," Mia whispered. "I love you, baby." He choked out, "I'm so proud of you." From the sidelines, Sarah watched. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Leo. "You did that, Mom," Leo said. "You built that." Sarah shook her head. "No, I just built the legs. They did the walking." As the song ended, the students, kids who had often ignored Mia or looked at her with pity, started to clap. It began with one person, then swelled into a roar. A standing ovation from a room full of 13-year-olds. Mia buried her face in her dad's coat, embarrassed but glowing. Mark lifted his head. He wiped his eyes, unashamed. He looked across the room and locked eyes with Sarah. He mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Epilogue: The Kinetic Family. The story didn't end at the dance. That was just the launch. Mark and Sarah filed for a patent the following month. Not to get rich, they open-sourced the code, but to protect the design so medical companies couldn't bury it. They called the device the Maya Project. Mark's friends helped set up a non-profit. They used the workshop to build low-cost kits for other kids. Sarah ran the engineering. Mark ran the logistics and training. They became a unit. And as for Sarah and Mark, it was a Tuesday, 6 months after the dance. The rain was falling in Seattle as always. Sarah was at her bench, soldering a new controller board. The bell chimed. Mark walked in. He wasn't carrying a broken truck part. He was carrying 2 coffees and a bouquet of rain-soaked lilies. He walked up to the counter. He set the coffee down. He didn't say anything about the weather or the work. "I have a problem," Mark said, his face serious. "Oh no." Sarah put down her iron. "Is the actuator slipping again?" "No," Mark said. "The problem is that I'm in love with my mechanic." Sarah froze. She looked at him. This man of few words, of action and honor, who had dismantled industrial robots with her and held her when she cried over failed code. That is a problem, Sarah smiled, walking around the counter, because your mechanic has a strict policy against dating customers. Good thing I'm not a customer anymore, Mark said, stepping into her space. I'm a partner. He kissed her. It tasted of coffee and rain and a future that was no longer broken. In the back of the shop, Mia and Leo were arguing over a video game. The 3D printer was humming, building a new part for a kid in Ohio who wanted to play soccer. Life was messy, parts broke, systems failed. But as Sarah knew, and as Mark had learned, anything could be fixed if you had the right tools, the right patience, and the right people to help you stand back up. This is the end of our story. Sometimes the miracles we wait for aren't magic. They are built with sweat, science, and the refusal to give up.